Greetings, happy friends, and welcome back to the MTG Struggle Bus, where I struggle more playing Magic so you can struggle a whole lot less. We're at it again. This time, I'm going to be sharing with you my top 5 tips for beginners that would like to draft on MTG Arena. So without further ado, let's get into it. Very quickly before we begin, I want to take a moment to give a shout out to the latest member writing in the Struggle Bus, Frank. Thank you so much for your ongoing support of the channel. Really do appreciate you, my friend. You rock, and this one's for you. But alright, these are my top 5 tips for drafting on Magic Arena for beginners. So some of my more advanced or veteran viewers may find these a little rudimentary or a little vague, but once again, it's geared for someone else. If that is something you want to see, slightly more advanced skills, let me know in the comments below, just so I know. But these are going to be tips that are going to help you throughout various formats. They're not going to be specific to any one format. That's why there's only 5, and that's why you're going to find out that they're kind of, once again, they're applicable in different ways. There's no particular order to these, so you can pick and choose which is your priority, but they're all very useful to set you up with a solid foundation for drafting if that's something that you are interested in, and a lot of it does bleed over into sealed as well. Without further ado though, tip number 1. Don't be married to your rare. I'm stating this one first because this is something that happens a lot to people. Now, if you're using draft to build your collection, by all means, take the rare. But once again, you want to not be married to it. What I mean is that sometimes you are going to be able to play the rare that you draft first. But the first pack one, pick one is the least influential, experienced, advised pick of the draft because you have no idea what you're getting past. So it could steer you in a specific direction. If it is a very powerful rare, then you would want to try to play it. But it is very important to understand somewhere around picks 3, 4, and 5 to really start IDing what you're getting past and whether you should hold on to your rare or not. Some rares are splashable where they only have 1 pip, or maybe, you know, they're multi-faction, but they only have 1 pip of something else, right? They're in one of your colors, but not the other. So then sometimes you can accommodate your deck or your mana pool if it's flowing that way for you to play that card. But that is one of the biggest pitfalls I see from people that I've had that issue sometimes myself. It took a lot of learning the hard way and struggle busting it before I finally let go of that one. But yeah, sometimes you can open up, let's say, for example, just for the sake of being extreme, a triple black rare that's just absolutely fantastic. Well, if you're not getting past black and instead you're getting past Gruul, red and green, you're going to have to let go. If not, you're going to end up getting second and third picks, you know, hand-me-downs from the players that are passing to you, and overall your deck's going to be a lot weaker versus not having that bomb rare, but your whole deck collectively is stronger. So once again, the tip here, don't be married to your rare. Really kind of try to identify the lane you're supposed to be in packs or picks 3, 4, 5, 6, and kind of ID those signposts that let you know what may be open. Who knows? Sometimes it pays off, it pays dividends, because then you might get that bomb rare that the people that are passing to you aren't going to play in pack 3. So that's my number 1 tip. Don't be married to your rare. Tip number 2, be mindful of your curve. This is very important in Limited, as Limited has become more and more of a staple of these sets that Wizards of the Coast develops. You'll find that there's a lot less room for people to just lollygag and durdle the first couple of rounds or turns of the game. And you may be left behind if you're focusing too high on your curve. It's really really enticing to play those 5, 6, 7 drop cards because they're so cool and do so much, but sometimes they can be stranded in your hand if you don't, you know, there's a big difference in making your 5th land drop and your 6th, and even a larger gap from your 6th to your 7th. So having too many 6s and 7s, and even sometimes 5s in your deck can really punish you. So you want to be mindful of your curve, like the example I have here, where if you look, just having my creatures here on the board or on the layout, you could see that I start off very heavy on the 2 drop, some 3s, some 4s, and then only 2 5s. I do this because, once again, this is a very, any format could be an aggressive format, but once again, they're making 1-drops more viable. 2-drops have plenty of viability and stuff. So making not, if you're on the draw and you don't make any move on the board until turn 3, you might just get ran over. So it's very important to keep that curve. And then once again, you have more chances to draw your bigger cards the later the game goes on, right? So for example, my Tiger Tribe Hunter, right? It's a 5-drop. So I have 5 turns to get the mana I need before I even remotely come close to playing it. And I might not even play that turn if I have to play a removal spell, right? So I have a longer time, I have more draws to see this card versus in turn 2, where I need to play something almost right away. So that's why I have a significant amount of 2-drops to make sure I hit that 2-drop, whether it's going to be aggressive to attack my opponent or to stay back on defense so my opponent can't attack me openly. So that is something to keep in mind. That being said, the average deck is somewhere between 15 to 17 creatures, give or take, and then 7 to 5 interactive spells, not non-creature spells, is what your typical limited deck is. Once again, those numbers can ebb and flow based on what you're drafting. And then, of course, I put all my non-creature spells on the side, and even then you can kind of tell there's a curve there as well. 1, 2, 3, 3, 2, or 4, 5. So once again, considering that. So that is my tip number 2. Be mindful of your curve throughout the drafting process. Tip number 3 is, oops, sorry, man, camera's a little low. Tip number 3, removal is always useful. Yes, removal is not only the stop you from losing, though that is about 70-80% of the time it is to stop you from losing the game, but sometimes you can even use removal to get a blocker out of the way or your opponent's bomb or something to help you win the race. But it is, once again, very important to have removal in your deck because you want to be able to deal with your opponent's threat. If you play just creatures, there is a chance that with combat tricks, they can blow you out, get you 2-for-1s. So removal is always useful. A couple of disclaimers. First off, you want to make sure that your removal mimics your curve like we mentioned in the previous rule. You can't stack your deck full of 5 and 6 cost removal because then it's going to feel pretty bad when you have to spend 6 mana to get rid of your opponent's 2-drop flyer or 3-cost flyer, right? It's your trading down. It's going to cost you your entire turn. Not very great. So you want a spread of removal that you can play throughout the game. 2, 3 cost, things like that. Like typically we see a lot of 1 in a red, deal 3 damage. Those cards are typically very good. So then you sometimes can even trade up on mana where you're spending 2 mana to kill your opponent's 4-drop that's a 4/3. On that note as well, you want to take in consideration removal that is sorcery speed versus instant speed, because instant speed does give you the opportunity to get a 2-for-1 on your opponent. You can hold it till combat happens, blocks are declared, maybe your opponent uses a combat trick to save their unit, their guy, and then you kill it with your fast speed removal, or vice versa. You can save your guy from dying by killing their guy before they do a fight effect or something like that. So be mindful of that as well. The other note I wanted to make on the removal aspect of it as well is that you want to try to get removal that is less dependent on your board state. Now, sometimes things like green, it doesn't have that option, right? A lot of their removal is fight effects, but things like pump spells can help as well. It's not exactly removal, right? Because it does require creature engagement, etc., etc. When I mean by removal, I mean literally the card by itself can take a creature off the board. The other thing to take into consideration is conditional removal versus unconditional. I mean a card that, and you typically don't see this very cheap. It's typically 4, 5, and even 6 costs where it just says destroy a creature. Those cards are solid because there's no stipulation. If there's absolutely something you just need dead, that card is going to do it. Versus going back to the abrade kind of deal 3 damage. You know, if the card that's beating you down is a 3/4, well, Abrade's not going to do that much unless you combo it with something else. Also, your opponent has the chance of negating it with a pump spell. So something to be mindful. Granted, these are still great cards and you should still play them, but something to look and kind of consider when you are trying to pick your removal. But once again, prioritize. It's always useful to have removal for one reason or another, so make sure your deck has some. But that'll do it for rule number 3. Rule number 4, my friends, draft cards that affect the board. This is a common mistake for beginner drafters where we see cards that look super cool. And what ends up happening is that we want to play these cards because they look super cool. The problem is, going back to my initial thing, where Limited is getting more and more aggressive and everything matters, you just can't afford to take a turn off. What I mean by this is, like, for example, let's say an enchantment that says when you play 2 creatures in 1 turn, you draw a card, right? You're like, oh, sweet, I can play a bunch of cheap creatures and do this. The problem is, the turn you play it, let's say it's 4 mana, that's spending 4 mana of your turn, then it comes down and you don't do anything to change the board. So if your opponent's already ahead, they're going to stay ahead. If your opponent is, if you guys are at parity, your opponent has a chance to get ahead, right? Or if you're beating down your opponent, that's not going to help you beat them down this turn. So things like that you see in this deck is something like, for example, Boots of Speed, where it's an equipment, and yes, I can get value from it later on, and that's why it's in the deck, but the turn I play it, right, it's not doing anything unless I can equip it to a creature that turn. Something else would be something like Unexpected Windfall, right? Sounds great. I could pitch a land later on in the game when I don't need it anymore. Once again, my curve stops at 5. So once I hit that 6th land, I could pitch it to Unexpected Windfall, draw 2 fresh cards plus 2 treasure. The problem is, that turn, right? If I have to cast this on turn 4 because I'm missing land drops or something like that, right? Or even, let's say I draw my 2 5-drops. Well, I spent 4 of my mana that turn. So that means that turn I'm not going to get to develop my board. It doesn't impact the board in any way. Now, removal does impact the board, right? It can kill a creature. It can get a blocker out of the way. It can kill a flyer that's hurting you. That affects the board. Combat tricks are kind of in that gray area, but they still affect the board. They can make your creatures bigger to win combat and somewhat. So even though they still require a creature on the board and some kind of interaction, it still affects the board. You kind of get what I'm getting at there. So another consideration would be something like Fate's Reversal, where I get a creature back from my graveyard, right? That doesn't necessarily do anything, but it is cheap enough where I think I could play that creature that turn. So it still somewhat affects the board. Plus, I have a bomb and some pretty sweet cards I wouldn't mind playing again if my opponent uses their removal on it, right? So that is rule number 4. Make sure to draft cards that affect the board. And for the time being, set aside those synergistic cards that just kind of end up being the engine or the facilitator for an engine. Finally, friends, rule number 5 is be on the lookout for mana sinks. Mana sinks are the kind of cards where when you have spare mana, you're not doing anything, you can throw that mana into that card for an effect. Something, this deck actually doesn't have anything like that because, well, that's just the way this kind of goes. This deck in particular doesn't have anything like that, but for example, let's say blue, right? Blue might have a card that says pay 5, draw a card, and it might be on a 2-drop. That card is great because early in the game, you could play it as a 2-drop and it'll do 2-drop things when you need it to. But later in the game, when you find yourself maybe flooding or you kind of expended your hand and you have 6-7 mana just sitting there on the board, you can take that extra mana that you're not using and use it so you're maximizing your turns. Green has been known to have this for various cards. That's like, you know, pay 4, put a +1/+1 counter on something. Red has ping effects, right? Pay 3, deal 1 damage to a target. Things like that give you the ability to use your mana turn after turn after turn that allow you to negate those non-turn game or non-active turns, right? If you're kind of in a board stall, like you can't attack your opponent, they can't attack them, and things are going on, you draw a land, you have nothing to do. Well, now having those mana sinks allow you to continue to be proactive on this board. Also, it allows certain cards to be playable anywhere on the curve. For example here, right, something like, let's say, Brazen Dwarf, right? It's a solid 2-drop, right? Comes down, does some blocks, doesn't attack great, but you need that in your curve, right? Well, drawing it on turn 5 or 6, it's significantly worse. Last thing I want to do is when my opponent's beating me down with 5 5s and 4 4s to play a 1/3. But going back to that example, let's say that I have that green 3/3 for 3, right? And pay 3, put a +1/+1 counter on something. Well, now when I draw it on turn 3 or 4, 5, or 6, I could play it and immediately put a counter on something. And so it has that late game application, as well as being perfectly fine to play it on curve as a 3/3 for 3. So be on the lookout for things like that. Sometimes they are enchantments, sometimes they are artifacts. Just once again, going back to our last rule, be mindful of it, make sure it affects the board. But once again, putting a +1/+1 counter on a creature does affect the board. So you kind of see how some of these rules overlap. And as you become more and more experienced in drafting, you'll be able to identify when these things synergize better and kind of make it happen. So once again, rule number 5, be mindful of your mana sinks. And just a quick bonus tip for my beginner drafters in Arena. If you want to continue to build your collection, if you have a bunch of wild cards, typically you're going to have a ton of commons and uncommon wild cards, right? You have a plethora of those. Well, to maximize the amount of excess cards, or what is it? Copy protection, I forgot what it's called, where they give you credit to your vault to generate those rares and mythic wild cards. If you have the extra wild cards, whenever a set comes out, craft all the commons and uncommons for that set. That way, when you are drafting, every single common and uncommon you take adds value to your vault that you can later cash them in for rares and mythic rares. But all right, friends, that is going to do it. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you got something out of this. Happy drafting. And until next time, as always, happy gaming.